So today is the 8th of November. It's the 63rd day of the war. And joining me from Jerusalem is the journalist, author of 4 non-fiction books about Israel, Matti Friedman, who's born in Toronto, but now lives, as I said, in Jerusalem. His latest book is called Who by Fire. It's about the Yom Kippur War, funnily enough, 50 years ago, almost to the day from October the 7th, when Leonard Cohen performed in the Sinai. So, Matti, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, Matti, perhaps should we start with your book and with Leonard Cohen and with the Yom Kippur War? I mean, it's so eerie how many resonances there are today from that period, which previously was one of the darkest, or probably the darkest in Israel's history. I'm not sure we can say that today.
Yes, I think that might have changed. I spent many years writing this book about the Yom Kippur War through the very strange angle of one of the weirdest rock and roll tours of all time, which is this concert tour that Leonard Cohen embarks on at the Sinai front in the middle of the war. And I spent a lot of time talking to veterans of that war, and it seemed to be the darkest moment in the history of Israel since 1948. This complete surprise. The country is euphoric after the 1967 victory and just does not see it coming. And on Yom Kippur, October 6th, 1973, there's a surprise attack on 2 fronts from the Egyptians and the Syrians, and the country is just reeling. And eventually, Israel manages to kind of pull it together and win the war, but Israel loses more than 2,600 fatalities in about 3 weeks, in a country that was at the time barely 3 million people. So we're talking about a major catastrophe that the country really never recovers from. The politics change, the culture changes, the music changes, and Israel after Yom Kippur is a different country. And then fast forward almost exactly 50 years, as you said, 50 years and 1 day to October 7th, 2023, and another devastating surprise, this time from Gaza. It also happens on a Jewish holiday, of course. It happens on Simchat Torah, and Israel's just not ready for it. And thousands of Hamas fighters come through the fence and just butcher hundreds and hundreds of civilians and overrun the defenders of the border and launch us on this terrible war that we're involved in right now. And I think that this moment might eclipse the Yom Kippur War as the darkest moment in Israel's history. I mean, if we're looking at 2,600 soldiers killed in 3 weeks, that's awful. Here we lost 1,200 people, most of them civilians, in 1 day. And we saw sites that were reminiscent of the Jewish world before the state of Israel, images that seem like pogroms, images that seem like the Holocaust, stories of kids hiding in closets and people hiding under beds as people kind of go through their houses trying to kill them. So for Israel, I think this trauma is probably deeper than the trauma of Yom Kippur, and the country after this war won't be the one that it was before October 7th.
Well, there's been quite a lot said about the similarities between the Yom Kippur War and now. But what about the differences? I mean, it strikes me that this is probably the longest war Israel has ever fought. I mean, Israel normally is known for quick wars, particularly the 6-Day War, obviously, but also, as you said, the Yom Kippur War was over in a matter of a couple of weeks. But this already is several times that length. What effects do you think that has on the country?
We certainly haven't fought a war this long since 1948. That was a long war. Of course, it was a very different society at the time. That war really starts at the end of 1947 and only ends at the very beginning of 1949. So that was quite long, but the context is completely different. I think maybe we can look at the fighting in Lebanon in the 80s and 90s. That was kind of protracted and painful. Was it exactly a war? We didn't call it a war. I've written about that as well, and I participated in that little non-war as a soldier. But yes, I think that we're in something that's quite unprecedented, and it's been going on for 2 months. Beyond the devastation in Gaza, we are getting news of 2, 3, 4 soldiers dying every day. It's just this kind of awful drip of names, these young people, regular soldiers, 18, 19, or reservists who could be guys in their 40s who are going into Gaza to save the country and coming out in a coffin. And this society hasn't dealt with anything like this for quite some time. I think we've become not exactly soft. I don't think we're soft compared to Western societies, but we are soft compared to what we used to be. we kind of got used to relative safety and relative prosperity, and we're having to accustom ourselves to something very different. It also doesn't look like it will be over anytime soon. This is the army's moving in a very kind of careful, step-by-step way. So it's not kind of a lightning blow at Hamas in Gaza. They're working very methodically in order to keep Israeli casualties down, and that means that it's long and it's messy, and the whole time we have hovering over us the knowledge that we have a threat of not just of equal weight, but of greater weight on the northern border. And Israelis have been evacuated from communities on the Lebanese border and can't go back until something is done about the fact that Hezbollah has its forces on the northern border. And how exactly that will be solved, we don't know, but it's quite possible that what we're seeing now is just phase one of a much more protracted war that might widen beyond Israel and its immediate neighbors. So we're definitely sailing into some stormy waters.
And we had the news yesterday that the son of Gadi Eisenkot, who's a former chief of staff and is one of the members of Israel's war cabinet, of which there are 5 members, is that right? 4 members, 5 members? Something
Sounds
like that.
about right. There are a few who are members and a few who are observers. I can never remember exactly how many.
Okay,
are
it's a small number. It's a small number of people.
Right. Yeah, it's a small number of top decision makers.
Yeah, so he's one of the most influential figures in prosecuting this war. The news came yesterday that his son had been killed in northern Gaza, I believe, which really rammed home how nobody is immune in Israel at the moment to this awful lottery of death. What impact has that death had on politics, on the media, and on the perception of the war? Has it made any change in Israel?
I don't think it's likely to change the direction of the war, but certainly it drew people's attention. People know Gadi Eisenkot was the chief of staff. People really like him. He's just a really likable character. He's not a kind of cold senior military command type. He's kind of a backslapping, kind of jovial character who's universally considered to be a really good guy. So every Israeli parent, certainly of army age children or any children, probably really felt just that tragedy. And it's kind of striking that the senior leadership, it shouldn't be striking, but the senior leadership of this country has children on the front lines. And that makes it very different from the leadership of almost any Western country. And if you look at the leadership of the United States or the UK, most people of the upper classes or most of the people who deal with political activities are nowhere near the military and can't really imagine what it is that the military does. And it's true of journalists as well. And I've dealt with that as well. People who purport to be describing wars often have absolutely no idea what they're talking about or what a war actually looks like. And for Israelis, it's very different. So Gadi Eisenkot is sitting in the cabinet directing the war, knowing that his son is on the front line of the war. And it makes it very different, I think, than it would be for an American president or a British prime minister to prosecute a war that is being fought by no one who he has ever met. And for Israelis, that situation is unimaginable, of course, and we just got a very painful illustration of how things are here.
Well, I think the only exception I can think of to that is the British royal family, who does send its members often to fight. And Prince Harry famously was conducting an interview in Afghanistan and had to throw the microphone away and run off to his helicopter to partake in a raid. But that's, like you say, that's very much the exception rather than the rule. But let's talk about then the media, because you used to be a journalist for AP for some years, ending, I believe, in 2011, if that's right. And you very famously wrote a couple of essays exposing what you saw as the media bias within the international correspondence covering Israel. Looking at the past few weeks and the coverage that has surrounded it now, how much has changed?
Since I wrote those essays in 2014, all the problems have been solved. So the coverage has been really wonderful and I would say flawless. So yeah, what's your next question? I was at the AP, which is the big US news agency. It's also the world's largest news organization, if you ask the AP. Reuters apparently also claims to be the world's largest news organization, but those are the two big news agencies doing a lot of the heavy lifting of news coverage. And I was there between 2006 and the very end of 2011, and didn't really expect to have any political problems coming from the left side of the Israeli political world. And I was quite surprised to find that that it did have political problems. And ultimately, I left because I felt that I couldn't write the kind of stories that I wanted to write. I couldn't describe reality as I saw it because I was kind of straitjacketed by this political activism that had taken over the press at that time. I think we've really seen it progress since then, and now it's taken over these same ideologies, the kind of post-colonial left. It's hard to know exactly what to call it, but I think we know what we're talking about. And it's now taken over much of the academy. It's taken over the NGO world, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, and other important parts of what used to be the kind of pillars of the liberal West. They've fallen to kind of a liberal, very aggressive and radical ideology, and I saw that happening inside the press. So I left, and then in 2014 wrote these essays explaining what I had seen, and they made quite a splash at the time. And I don't know if we said things went viral at the time in 2014, but they went viral and they were widely read, and they seem to have absolutely no impact on the press itself. I think they did have impact on a lot of people who were convinced maybe not to believe what they're reading in the press. But press coverage remains largely an ideological fantasy, and you do get some right-wing ideological fantasy if you're looking for a certain kind of fantasy. You can find it on Fox News, you can find it the Wall Street Journal, and you'll find that that world if you know where to look for it. What has happened to most of the mainstream press, or what we used to call the mainstream press, is that it's become part of this very ideological world that includes those NGOs and includes the United Nations and includes the academy. It's just this very ideological world that sees things through the lens of ideology and politics and not through the lens of reality. So if you don't have reporters on the ground who are knowledgeable and who are honestly just trying to figure out what's going on and explain a complicated story to people who are far away, if you don't have that, and instead you have activists who are trying to mobilize people toward the correct political position, then you have a public that is completely baffled as to what is exactly going on. You have a lot of anger and kind of political mobilization rather than understanding of the complexities of this conflict or of any other place. So something big has broken down in the press, and I think this war of the last 2 months might be the most dramatic illustration of what has happened. But of course, there are many other examples.
That phrase, ideological fantasy, that the press or reporters are constructing, I mean, that's a powerful way of putting it, and a very non-compromising one. Do you think that's really right when you look at the coverage of the war over the last 8 weeks or so? What signs, what evidence do you see of that?
I think that what these organizations seem to want, and maybe what many of their viewers and readers want, is a simple story that is as close to a children's fairy tale as possible. So if possible, we need a princess and a dragon. We need to know who to love and who to hate. And what makes a good news story is very close to what makes a good children's bedtime story. As journalists, we like to think that our art is completely divorced from the art of storytelling. In fact, we believe it to be a kind of science, right? So you have chemistry, biology, journalism, physics. Those are the sciences. But if we're being honest, then of course news is a form of storytelling, and what makes a good bedtime story is what makes a good news story. If possible, 2 characters, no more than that. One of them a good guy and one of them a bad guy. And you can see that the Israel story is very much placed in that framework. People are being told that this is a war by a highly sophisticated military against innocent civilians. That the images are illustrating that story. The thrust of the press coverage is meant to tell that story. And of course, that's not at all what's happening. What's happening is that a very small ethnic minority in the Middle East, which also runs the only democracy in the area, is trying to defend itself from a threat on its border. And this is an organization that has built a military landscape that is indistinguishable from the civilian landscape in Gaza, and it's done that on purpose. So this is a war that Hamas started on October 7th, and it's a war being fought completely on a battlefield Hamas is making. And that's the reason that you're seeing what you're seeing. And that's a very complicated story. Then it's harder to push it into a Princess Dragon dynamic, but that requires reporters to understand what they're seeing. It requires reporters to be skeptical of the information they're getting from Gaza. It requires people to kind of have a handle on very complicated events. And most of the reporters simply don't. They just don't have the tools, and they don't have the inclination, because a story that is complicated and full of murky gray zones will just be a less compelling story than the story about terrible, stormtroopers from Star Wars abusing innocent natives who just want to grow organic olives and live peacefully. That's a compelling story. Of course, it's completely nonsense, but that doesn't seem to stop it from being promoted.
Right. I mean, you do see some very overt examples of this. I mean, I'm reminded of one, a Sky News correspondent a few days ago tweeted that journalists had not been allowed by the Israeli military into Gaza because they wanted people to remain ignorant to their war crimes. And I mean, there's an internal fallacy in that statement, isn't there? Because in order to establish that somebody's committed war crimes, you need to go there and see the evidence. And if you haven't seen the evidence, you cannot say that they've committed war crimes. But she sort of glossed over that. But then there are other instances where people are dealing with a very fast-moving news picture, often on the ground, making sense of fragments of information that are being pieced together very quickly and trying to communicate that to viewers, often under some pressure and sometimes some danger. Do you make allowances for the pressures? I mean, as a journalist yourself, you've experienced that. Do you make allowances for the pressures of 24/7 news coverage?
Of course, it's very hard to get it right. And I don't think that most people in the system are malevolent. And I don't even think most people in the system have particularly fervent political views. My own experience was that the key people, the decision makers, have a political agenda which overrules the journalistic agenda, but most people are just going about their business, trying to do their job and not get fired. But because of the ferocity of the news cycle and the speed, you often see the kinds of decisions that people make very quickly. And I think that often it's in the quick decisions that you see the deep psychology. For example,
right.
A week or two into the war, the Hamas authorities in Gaza, flying under the misleading name Gaza Health Ministry, told the press that Israeli aircraft had struck a hospital called El Ahli and had killed at least 500 people. And that didn't really make sense. It didn't make sense that Israel would have struck a hospital in the first place. And it didn't make sense that Hamas would know the casualty numbers, within an hour of a huge event like that. But everyone reported it. Something about it made sense to the press, and everyone across the board reported it. For a while, Sky News was saying it's 500, but it might be as many as 800. And then it turned out very quickly that it hadn't happened at all as described, and it was an Islamic Jihad rocket that landed in the parking lot, and there were fatalities, but the numbers were nowhere near what had been reported. And that lie was so blatant that it had to be walked back. It was too clear that hadn't happened. But you saw this readiness to believe it. That did make sense. It's the pressure of the news cycle. People have to put out a news alert. They want to beat the competition. They see that story. I think a sane and knowledgeable reporter who's been here for a while would not have put that story out. Right. But everyone did. And I think that says something about what the organizations are up to. If your job is to carefully explain very complicated events that have the capacity to inflame world opinion, then you need to be very, very careful. But if you see your job as kind of rushing out, inflammatory stories and trying to generating the political picture that suits you or your employers, then hit send on that story and see what happens. I'm not sure anyone was fired for it. I haven't heard that there were any serious disciplinary repercussions for anyone who was involved in that story. I think once the dust settles after this war, which is a very terrible war, of course, and many thousands of innocent people in Gaza are being killed, I wouldn't want to be understood as saying otherwise. But after this war, when the dust settles, we'll see many examples, I think, of decisions like that, leading the coverage with the death toll as presented by Hamas, a death toll that if you look closely at the numbers, it doesn't add up in terms of what they're saying is happening. And you know, probably a few months after the war, someone will do a calculation and say, "Oh dear, we seem to have miscalculated a bit, and perhaps some of our reporting was off." But I don't think you'll see any major repercussions. And I'm saying that as someone who's watched these rounds in Gaza happen since 2008 with a fairly similar script each time, although this time it is much larger in scale than the previous ones.
Right, and one example that comes immediately to mind when you talk about people making decisions under pressure and their true colours coming out, and also the lack of accountability, is the case of John Donison, the BBC reporter who famously went rogue when the hospital had been hit, and said that and speculated that it has all the hallmarks of an Israeli strike, and it's very difficult to see any alternative. And it was, you know, suggest all but reporting that it was an Israeli strike. And the Jewish Chronicle reported shortly after that this was the same person who had previously got into trouble by tweeting a picture of a casualty in Syria and blaming the Israelis for it in Gaza, and had to apologize for that. So again, we see that trend threading through some of the coverage.
I mean, I think the deep flaw that you're alluding to, and we can go back as far as 2002 and the Jenin massacre story. There was a similar incident where the Palestinians came forward during fighting in 2002 and accused the Israelis of carrying out a massacre in the city of Jenin, and it never happened. It was a complete invention, but it got a few weeks of news coverage, much of it very credulous. And it's the same dynamic. There is a belief that comes to the surface in situations of stress or situations of high emotion. Like now, there is this belief in much of the press corps that the Israelis are malevolent, that they're capable of murdering civilians for no reason. In fact, they want to. They're doing this and they're hiding it. And you could see it in that tweet from the Sky correspondent. They're not letting us into Gaza because they're hiding their war crimes. Gaza's packed with cameras. The only body that's limiting news coverage in Gaza, of course, is Hamas, because they're trying to hide their war crimes. But there's this idea that Israel is successfully masking its true self. Israel has no reason to kill civilians, even if we leave morality aside. It's bad for Israel, right? It invites international pressure. It shortens the timetable we have to work with in this war in order to destroy Hamas. So the deaths of civilians are bad for Israel. So that, of course, Israel is not doing this on purpose. And yet there's this desire to believe that's true. And if we could only reveal it, and it comes to the surface, most of the time reporters kind of have themselves kind of in check and are managing to control their speech, and sometimes they're not. And it happens when they become angry, or it happens when they're in a hurry, and that's when you kind of get a peek into the deep psychology, which I think is quite frightening. I mean, the idea that Jews are kind of malevolent actors who are secretly open to murdering children when we can get away with it. I mean, that's a very deep idea, of course, and one that has very little to do with journalism.
Yeah. I mean, the example that you bring up of Jenin from 2002 was a shocking one, because you had reporters, the most prominent reporters from the most prominent broadsheets in Britain, Times, Telegraph, etc., saying that they had seen something, or that they had solid eyewitness testimony at the very least of something that had not happened, based on one person who was very flawed and a rumor and assumptions. And you're right in saying, I think, or alluding to the idea that the roots of this conception of the blood-sucking Jew that tries to kill children and cover it up has roots that are thousands of years old. In fact, stretching back to 1144 in Norwich with the first ever blood libel. But I think it might come down to...
It was a great moment of British innovation, of course.
Of course. But I think there's something else as well, that you mentioned the word post-colonialism, which I've been thinking a lot about recently, because post-colonialism is something that informs a lot of the ways in which the progressive left thinks in academia and elsewhere in other parts of society. But it also forms a big part of Hamas's way of thinking. The Palestinian militancy from the 60s onwards, the PLO and so forth, were really looking to places like Algeria, where 120-year-odd French occupation had been ended by a post-colonial radical Islamist war which involved great brutality and terror against the French, forced the French into a brutal response which was pilloried by the world, and eventually caused the French to withdraw. That's 120 years. Israel is 75 years old. And it feels like that was really the founding principle of Palestinian militancy, and it explains a lot of the cruelty and the hyper-violence of Hamas to this day. Of course, Hamas is boosted by extra Islamic fanaticism, but nonetheless, they're trying to get rid of the Jews in the same way as the Algerians got rid of the French. And that post-colonialism is shared by people in the progressive left, but also is at the foundation of Hamas. Don't you think that's right?
Yes, I mean, I think that's part of what's going on. I see Hamas as fundamentally a religious group, and I think that they're quite open about it. I think that often Western people have trouble with that because the West has become so secular, and often I think when I speak to Western people who are religious themselves, Christians who are very fervently, involved in their faith, they have very little problem understanding Hamas. Hamas has scripture, and they think God is speaking to them, and they want to do what they think God wants them to do, and that makes sense to a religious sensibility, and less so to a secular sensibility. And then we kind of come up with other reasons for what they're doing. I definitely think they do draw inspiration from stories like the French in Algeria, and from the end of the colonial powers in the Middle East. And but if you look at their founding charter, for example, or even at their discourse, including interviews with their leaders over the past 2 months, they're very clear about what this is. This is it's about religion. There can be no sovereignty of non-Muslims in the Islamic world. The murder of Jews is not only legitimate but desired by God, and they will do October 7th again and again and again until their religious script plays out in the way they want it to play out. And I think we have to listen. I think that many Israelis just did not want to hear that. You don't want to believe that that's true, right? We would like to believe that Hamas ultimately will be practical. They have to, run the lives of 2 million people in Gaza. Eventually, it's just going to, it's going to click that they need to do that, and that will be really what they want to do. But that's not what they want to do. That's not how they see their role in the world. Their role in the world is to be the sword of Islam against the infidels, and to create an Islamic caliphate that includes Jerusalem and that has no Jews in it. So, and they're quite open about it. One thing I like about the Hamas guys is that they're very honest about who they are and what they want to do. And I think that we just have to listen. I think it's our mistake. I think in many ways, October 7th was our mistake. I think we need to look at ourselves and ask, how did we let this happen? And think less about the enemy. The enemy told us that's what they were going to do. The question is, why did we ignore him?
Right. I mean, you're absolutely right. I didn't mean to downplay the Islamism at all. In fact, I think that in actual fact, in addition to this religious fundamentalism and fanaticism, there's also the influence of Nazism, isn't there, from the Second World War? And we see that in the Hamas charter that cites the protocols of the Elders of Zion and other Nazi ideas. But let's move on just for the last few minutes to talk once again, or move back to talk once again about our friend Leonard Cohen, because that was about morale, wasn't it? And right now, Israel seems to have a lot of morale. In fact, one poll a couple of weeks ago showed that Israeli optimism had actually increased since the war rather than decreased. What are your thoughts on Israeli morale? Where does it come from, and what does it need? Do we need another Leonard Cohen tour? I mean, what can people do to help Israeli morale, even though it's as impressive as it already is?
Well, Leonard, if you're out there and listening to this podcast, man, we could really use a concert. I really miss that voice, that deep, really kind of just sensitive and spiritual voice. I think it would be amazing for us right now. And it's too bad that Leonard's gone. I guess we could try to think of some equivalents who might be able to lift the spirits of Israelis at this moment, but I can't really think of very many, and I can think of even fewer who would actually want to come and identify with Israel.
You know who would? David Draymond would.
Okay.
who famously, for the singer of Disturbed, who covered The Sound of Silence so brilliantly and virally. I think his mum lives in Israel. He's a very big supporter of Israel. He might do it.
All right.
Similar
We'll
voice
take
as well. Similar voice.
the the cohesiveness of Israeli society and the kind of forward movement of Israeli society is something quite remarkable. So after the war breaks out, we really have this feeling that the government has disappeared. That there's a day, October 7th, when it feels like there is no state of Israel. And these thousands of terrorists are wandering around the country, slaughtering people, and the army isn't there. And it takes, in some cases, more than 24 hours for the army to get there. And then afterwards, the prime minister disappears for a while, and the government just isn't functioning. And into the vacuum comes this incredible mobilization of Israeli volunteers, including, interestingly, the protest movement that had been protesting against Netanyahu for a year leading up to the outbreak of the war. Overnight, the protest organizations just turn into kind of social welfare organizations, and the same volunteers begin housing all the people evacuated from the Gaza communities, feeding them, feeding soldiers. People show up for reserve duty at such a rate that the army does not have enough weapons to give all the soldiers who are showing up to join the army. So you have this incredible surge of volunteerism, and that probably explains the optimism. There's something about this society that is incredibly energetic and cohesive. And I think that there's a deep depression in Israel at the moment. There's a real fear about what's going on. This is a terrifying time for people. Death is present all the time, and we're just waiting for the next axe to drop and or the next rocket to fall. And it's an awful time, but it is a time when Israelis feel common fate, and we feel like that there's no one to depend on except ourselves, and that glue, I think, is very powerful. Will it be enough to get us through the next 10 or 15 years? No. We will need a functional, creative political leadership that can put the society back together and move forward. We do not have that at the moment. I think there's much to be optimistic about when we look at Israeli society, and very little reason for optimism when we look at the Israeli political system. And I, like many others, hope that we're going to see a real change after this war. There's clearly going to be a lot of political upheaval after the war, and hopefully it'll lead to something better than we had on October 6th.
Right, and just the final question before I let you go, Matti, about the media. People often ask me, where's the best place to turn for proper reporting of Israel? Aside from the Jewish Chronicle, of course. What would you recommend to people?
I think the Jewish Chronicle is all you need. Not just for Israel, probably for any area of knowledge you're interested in. That's what I'm supposed to say, right? I think for Israel, if you're looking for a really good wrap of the daily events, the Times of Israel does a superb job. The editor of the Times of Israel is David Horowitz, who's a veteran journalist, a really excellent journalist. And the Times of Israel has really just become, it's my go-to website. I could check any number of news sources in Hebrew, but I use the Times of Israel just because I find that it's the best. So I would definitely recommend them. Sometimes there are good reporters working for organizations whose Israel coverage is generally terrible, and you can find them. You just have to know their name and look specifically for that byline. So I'm not saying that everyone who works at every organization is terrible. It's always a good idea to look for people who know how to speak Hebrew. If you want someone who understands Israel, or if you're looking for someone who understands the Palestinians, speaking Arabic would be a pretty good idea. It's actually shocking how seldom Western reporters speak the languages of the countries that they cover. And if you told someone from the UK, if I presented myself as an expert on the UK, but I couldn't speak English, any Brit would think that was hilarious. But often the people reporting other countries are just that guy in another country. So that's a way of finding the good people, the people you can trust. And in general, we're forced to navigate a blizzard of disinformation and political nonsense that's being pushed at us from many different directions, sometimes by people who don't even realize that's what they're doing. And that's just unfortunately a feature of living in the world in 2023, and we're just going to have to deal with it.
Right, and I think that in Britain, the right-wing media, weirdly enough, are, well, not weirdly enough. There's a reason for it. We won't go into that. It tends to be more accurate. The Telegraph has been great. Sunday Telegraph in particular has been great. The Daily Mail's been good. The Sun has been good if you feel that way inclined. And it really is the left-wing voices that dominate broadcasting on the whole, and the left-wing press where things begin to get a bit more problematic.
I agree. I'm on the left in terms of my own political sensibilities, but when I consume news about Israel in from Western media outlets, it's usually in the more right-leaning outlets where I'll find information that makes much more sense to me as someone who lives and reports here. And it's not necessarily true on other subjects that I'm interested in, but it's certainly true on this subject. And the reason for that is, as you said, interesting and complicated, and maybe worth a separate podcast episode.
Well, maybe soon we'll speak about that, Matti. But for now, that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll just remind podcast listeners that you can also watch this on YouTube, and YouTube viewers that you can also listen to this on the podcast. Matti, thank you again, and I hope you join us for another chat sometime.
Thank you again for having me.